All right, so apologies for all the environment issues. It looks like there's some issues with Rails versions and Ruby versions. For those that have the issue, you're now that much more of an expert on setting things up, and trial by error sometimes is the way to go with configuration. But we'll try to get that sorted out for next week so we don't have the same issues. But at least those who faced it now probably feel a little more comfortable switching the Ruby versions, running bundle, working with that sort of stuff. It's never fun, but it is important to know. But to the topic of the lab today, so the first milestone was problematic because of all the configuration, but it's always a good idea to run Rails server immediately. Make sure you can get the app up and running, and we can run RSpec. For milestone 2, when you guys ran this, you probably saw that a bunch of tests started to fail, and you had to add in a password confirmation. Right, so the test, I believe the sign in spec, or sorry, the sign up spec, started to pass in some information. Like here you see with 3 fields, right? So it's looking for essentially a password confirmation field. And so the devise view that came standard didn't have it. But on this page, right, to create a new account under the devise registrations layout, you have to add in a password confirmation field to get the test to pass, right? And that was our first example today of test-driven development, and kind of writing the test first, and then going back and adding in the functionality and making sure that it all works. Right, so hopefully this one was pretty easy for everyone. For like a more of a UI-based test, if you wanted to actually expect the page to have some content, it's probably handy to run Rails server just to check what it actually looks like, and you can write a test. That's a lot of times how integration tests work on the UI side. If you don't have a clear visual spec of what it's supposed to look like, sometimes you just run what it is, look what it looks like, and write a test that ensures that, so that if things change later, they're not going to break. You have a question? Or? Like these, like to have content? Exactly. So that is the RSpec documentation that we talked about at the beginning of the lab. So if we pull it up, you see here there's a few different modules, and there's a few that are most important. So RSpec expectations has a lot of the main RSpec matchers, and you see here built-in matchers. So these are more of your basic logic. So equals, regular expressions, right? Truthiness, expecting there to be an exception being thrown, right? So these are your standard kind of control. There are also one specific to Rails, and that's RSpec Rails. And so you'll start to see here, if we look at RSpec Rails, we'll pull up some of the matchers, and then we start to see some that are more specific to Rails. So rendering template, redirect to, route to, right? These are more kind of Rails views. And if you want to get even further, you can start to add in RSpec with Capybara and start to add in more configuration. And we'll actually get to that in a different milestone. So one more thing to cover is before, and some of you started to do this in your tests. So we'll open up a product spec test, right? And let's say we want to write a test about our discount amount, right? Milestone 5. You can define a before block. And you notice that this block is in the context of the describe block, right? What this is saying is before each test, which is encapsulated by these it blocks, go ahead and run a before. And the default for before is actually before each. So those 2 lines are identical. Before is the same as before each. And that'll mean it'll run this block before each test. Remember last time we talked about each test is its own database transaction, right? So after the test gets run, it'll undo all the database transactions in that test. So if you define a before block, we can kind of have this line here, which instantiates for us a product. There's also before all, which basically means just run it once. Once, and then all these tests use the same. That's kind of a little clumsy. Really, there's not a huge reason to use that other than performance. If there's like a super long runtime for the test that you're going to run. But before each is usually recommended, and it's the same as before. And that's kind of nice to use so that you can move out all of the data creation into its own block, and that gets run before every test.
Can we have both befores in one context?
Like before and then before all? I believe so. If you need that to be your use case, then sure. So milestone 3 was guard. That also threw some problems for some people. I guess another configuration thing. If we look at the commit, it essentially adds in what's called a guard file, right? And for those who are able to get it to work, it runs your test anytime you save a file in the folder. So it just speeds up that development cycle. You write a test or you modify your logic, you save it, and automatically runs it. And you'll see here it's just adding a gem, and then it adds a configuration file, which is this guard file. And so you can, if you want to, you can specify or change things up. One thing to note here is it specifies the command. It says bundle exec rspec. For a few people, that command wasn't working, and instead bin/rspec works. So then you have to just modify this to the command that you want it to run. But there's a lot of configuration here, most of which we don't really care that much about. But this command line is the most important to us. Great. So milestone 4, right, was starting to actually write some tests using test-driven development. And last time we did events.upcoming, and this time we're going to do product.alphabetical. And so hopefully you guys started to write some tests first. And if we'll look at it, so we wrote tests for our product, and we'll pull it up here, the product spec, right? Alphabetical test, and we want to do similar things last time where we test with an empty data set and make sure it returns to us an empty data set. We would test on just a single product and make sure that it actually returns to us that singleton item, but still an array. And you'll notice here that we create things, but we create first B and then A, right? Can anyone tell me why we do that and not the opposite, which would be something like this? Why do we not want to do it this way? Exactly. If we call product.all, it'll return it to us in the right order because this is the order in which we've created it in the database, right? So the IDs already are lined up. So to ensure that the test is actually going to test alphabetical order and not just order by ID, it's a good practice to, change up the order and then test that the order was actually changed and return to us in the right format. And remember with expect, right? So what is here is what the actual value is, right? This is the value that the logic returns to us. And the second argument over here is the expected value. So if the test outputs incorrect value, expected was this, but the actual was this, right? We know that the expected is the second set of items, which is over here, and the actual is what's underneath the parentheses. Just something to keep in mind as you debug your tests. And similar thing, one more test for A, B, and C, so for 3 elements. Again, we want to create the order to be non-standard so that when we actually test it, we're testing the alphabetical function. Great. That was part of that. The other thing we did was we did feature, right? And so I talked earlier about feature versus request. And you start to see that in a feature test when you use Capybara, right? It started more UI-based integration testing. And so can anyone take a gander or take a guess at the difference between feature and request? Right, a feature test. Did anyone write a feature test today? It depends on the view, you said? That's good, right? So a feature test essentially is from the user's point of view interacting with a feature, right? So a feature could be signing in, or it could be buying a product, or getting a list of products back, right? So it's very heavy on the user interaction. And so you use Capybara to manipulate elements on the screen, and then your test will also look at the view elements, right? You're going to say, ensure that this item is present on the page, or ensure that if we look at the products and we sort them alphabetically, the titles come back as such. And if we look at the product helper spec, we'll start to see some helpers around, right, the view. So this one is a helper around product discount info, which is a discount function. Let's see, in the lab, it asks you to write a feature spec around sort products. So let's see, right? So here's the sort products feature spec. And it says a scenario, and a scenario is very similar to an it before. We have a context, which is similar to describe, right? Similar terminology, or same functionality, just different terminology. And you notice here that it's kind of looking at UI elements, right? So expecting the links to equal a certain value. So it's kind of thinking about it from the context of how a user interacts with the feature. Okay, so it's one feature, and this feature is, clicking on sort by alphabetical actually works. So we create some alphabetical elements, and then the user will visit the path. And you notice here that we first actually add in a test to make sure that they're not alphabetical, right? So we're testing the default scenario, which is non-alphabetical. Then we apply some sort of action. In this case, it's the click link. After the action is applied, we then ensure that the proper result was shown to the user, which is this last line here, right? And that's a complete feature. Now, the difference between a feature and a product spec is, request spec, is a request is thinking about it more from the backend perspective, so like a Ruby request. So if we're thinking about a Ruby request from start to finish, right, you're not going to manipulate the UI elements as much. You're more going to send a request, and then you'll look at the response that comes back from that request, and you're going to test that. So it's a little more nuanced than a feature. A feature kind of encapsulates more of the user experience, versus the request is a simple request. To create a new user, we verify the user was created. So in this example here, right, they're trying to log in. So we append some information to the request, send the request, and then ensure that on the response we have certain information. It's a little more focused. So there's a kind of a small difference there, and both of these tests depend on the use case. So in some cases, you may want to use a request spec, and in some cases, you want to use a feature. It's really up to you to depend on how you want to actually, what you're trying to test and what the test is trying to accomplish. But they're very, kind of more, they're bigger tests than just testing a specific controller or a specific route. Great, so hopefully you wrote, we had to get to sorting and doing some alphabetical stuff. And then milestone 5 was adding in some discount, right? So similar thing again, we wanted to first write the function, and then we wanted to actually write the implementation of it. So if we go to our product spec, we have here a discount amount, and you'll see that we define some value. This is just kind of, Ruby has provided nice shorthand with this underscore to separate it out. So this is 100,001. And we're going to expect it to be within a certain value of our discount. So we expect the discount to be 0.21 or 21%, right? And we're looking at the discount amount. Now that we've written our function, right, to test it out, we actually have to write the implementation of it. So if we look at discount amount, we can actually do this pretty simply. We can just use a bunch of return statements, right? And we say if the value is above a certain amount, go ahead and return 0.41, right? So if the value is above 800,000, return to us a 41% discount. If it's above 200,000, return to us a 31% discount, right? Otherwise, the discount is 0. And the discount here means the percent off of the value. Now, how do we use that? Well, the function beneath it, right, is the final price raw. And that is the price times 1 minus the discount amount. Okay? So we're taking the discount amount, and we're essentially saying if the discount is 41%, then the final price raw is the actual price times 59%, right? Or 1 minus 41. And that's great. But the actual activity asks us to come up with kind of a rounding, so it rounds it to the nearest, I believe, 100,000s or 10,000s. So we can apply a rounding, and we'll use a separate function here, final price, and we'll round it, and we supply minus 4, which means round it in 4 digits to the left. So equivalence of rounding it to the nearest 10,000s. And so now we kind of have these functions, and we can kind of test out final price and final price raw. So if we go back to our test, right, great, we tested the discount amount. If we supply some sort of value, we can then make sure that the discount meets our expectations. Now let's go ahead and test the final price and the final price raw. And you'll notice one thing of interest is we start to use a let statement, right? Before we're using a before statement, and now we're using a let. And what's the difference? Well, a before is run before every test. So no matter what the test does, even if the test has no information in it, it still executes the before statement. This let is a lazy test. It won't actually execute this block until you call product. The benefit of that is if you have a test that doesn't call product, you save the runtime of having to actually call and execute this block. So let's say we kind of had a very heavy test. We want to do some load balancing, right? So we wanted to do some products, and we said 100.times create product.create or something, right? We want to do a load balancing test. This all of a sudden becomes a little more of an expensive test, right? We're creating 100 products. That'll take a few seconds. If we do it in a before block, it'll get run automatically, and maybe that's okay. But maybe we have some tests that don't actually need it. And if we call let, this block only gets execute when you reference products. So it's a lazy way of instantiating your objects for your test, which is nice. But other than that, it's very similar to a before block. But we're here going to test the final price is raw. We're going to make sure it's equal to certain amounts. And then finally, we're going to test the final price. So if we kind of stub out the final price raw, right, we say let the final price raw be a certain value. And that way, we're simply testing the rounding function by supplying in a value and then testing the output right here. Right, so this is basically a way to do a method stub. You can stub out the value of final price raw. And so that we're simply testing nothing else except the final price function, right? We're saying, all right, the final price function takes a raw value and rounds it. And we want to test just simply that. We can stub out the final price raw for some value and then see what the value is after it's rounded. And that was milestone 5. So hopefully you guys are able to work through and learn a lot. I'll post this recap, and it has a lot of the commits in it, so you can feel free to go through and kind of check this out at your own leisure. But testing, as we said on Monday, is very important. It's important to kind of ensure the application doesn't break after you build out features. It's also important to know that what you built actually works as you expect it to, and to have the confidence to say that based off your tests. So we'll be writing tests, throughout the week, but this is kind of the test-heavy and test-focused week. Are there any questions? Min? The results? Yeah, so in this recap, there's links to the commits. And you'll notice here that, so the commits have a lot of these. I'll also post the branch I used to kind of have a lot of these files, so you can check them out. But I'd encourage you, if you didn't complete any of the steps, to not just go straight to the answer and read the answer, but try it out, see how much you can do, and then check the answer or check this reference after you've done it yourself, right? It's always more rewarding to try it out yourself and then compare after to see what you did differently. So maybe I'll post this like in a day. So if you want to, work on this later, you can, and then I'll post this. I'll post the review tonight, and maybe I'll share the branch later. Something. Any other questions? Alrighty. Well, great work tonight.